Thomas Jefferson's chilling warnings about unchecked fiat paper money proved prophetic as the U.S. plunged into its first boom-bust economic crisis in the early 19th century. That's how Mike Meharry kicked off a great new article we published just yesterday, going through Jefferson's warnings about the dangers of fiat money printing. Jefferson basically predicted the boom-bust cycle we live under today, we labor under today. I'm going to go through the highlights, but first of all, welcome and thank you so much for being here. Thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the Fast Friday edition of the show for April 19th, 2024. And let me get right to it. A little background here, pointing out that the first real economic panic happened in 1814. Officially, this is from a book or a paper called A Brief History of Panics and Their Periodical Occurrence in the United States. It's published in 1916. They write that our first panic, that of 1814, came as a result of our long exclusion from foreign markets. We'll find out why in just a moment. Being followed by the stimulation given business through resumption of our foreign trade in 1814, which was immensely heightened by the banks issuing enormous quantities of irredeemable paper. And that's what Thomas Jefferson was talking about in January 1814 in a letter to Thomas Cooper. He's basically predicting what's happening. He said, everything predicted by the enemies of the banks in the beginning is now coming to pass. We are to be ruined now by the deluge of bank paper as we were formerly by the old continental paper. And anyone who understands that period of the continental, not worth a continental, they understood that if you print too much, if you have too much paper, it depreciates, and then you run into all kinds of economic issues. Jefferson, of course, was holding the line on this, even though many others were not. But back to Meharry, he points out that just a year after that letter in 1815, a depression gripped the United States. The economic downturn lasted until 1821. There were some boom and bust going on in there, and it is widely viewed as the first boom-bust period in U.S. history. Of course, the whole thing is rooted in excessive money printing, and it was exactly what Jefferson predicted. He called it. Mike points out that the economic downturn came on the heels of the War of 1812. As so often happens, war results in all kinds of other problems even after the fact. Mike said that after the war, which ended in 1815, banknotes began to rapidly depreciate due to the exponential increase in the amount of paper in circulation. So when they print up a bunch of stuff to be able to fund government stuff that they couldn't afford to do based on, well, the economic situation of the time, it takes a little time before the impact of that happens. We see how this is playing out today with so much price inflation that has been the result of so much depreciation or inflation of the money supply a few years ago. Even if they slow it down and cut it off now, it could still continue to get worse as the money circulates through the economy. Anyways, Mike says, as economist Murray Rothbard had explained in his book, The Panic of 1819, which you absolutely should read, it'll be linked to in the show notes. Alan Mosley will get that organized. I'll get it published in a couple of hours here after the live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. As Rothbard pointed out in his book, The Panic of 1819, to fund the war, the federal government turned to state-chartered banks. The reason was there was no central bank at the time. The first bank of the United States, its charter expired, and there was no central bank. There wasn't a second bank of the United States established till 1816 after the war was over, and it didn't open for business till 1817. So the feds couldn't just print what they wanted. So this proliferation of state government chartered banks started doing it instead. And the feds, Mike writes, turned to these state chartered banks, and they issued large numbers of paper money banknotes, far exceeding the amount of gold to back them. And again, here's a link to that Panic of 1819 over at the Mises Institute. Awesome read. But as Meharry points out, he said this caused this money printing beyond, or this banknote printing beyond the amount of specie to back it, caused the gold to drain from these banks. But to keep the money flowing, the government, the feds, agreed to a suspension of specie payments so they wouldn't lose what they had left. And the situation then persisted well after the war ended. This allowed the banks, Mike writes, to make loans with little to no regard for gold reserves to back them, which is causing more and more problems. Of course, this is a formula, as Mike points out, for disaster. Thomas Jefferson understood this all too well, making his views clear in that same letter to Cooper in 1814. Here's how Jefferson put it. I am an enemy to all banks discounting bills or notes for anything but coin. But our whole country is so fascinated with this jack-lantern wealth that they will not stop short of its total and fatal explosion. Or we could call it an implosion is how we'd probably refer to it today. But people get fascinated by stimulus checks and government handouts. And they think that they're rich. They think that just having more dollars in their hands means they have more money, and they don't think about the impact of it later on. It's short-term thinking. And maybe it seems great today, but it certainly causes a lot of what we would refer to as malinvestment. Because if you encourage people, for example, they give people a bunch of stimulus checks to stay at home and not work, then maybe they are more willing to spend an excessive amount, like $10 on a cupcake. And then people who want to start a business, they think that a cupcake business that can have enough customers to sell $10 cupcakes is a worthy thing to start going. And then you get a boom in a cupcake business. I think there's been some research and articles done on this particular scenario. Hopefully it's a decent example, but eventually things come crashing down and people stop being able to afford the $10 cupcakes, and they might want to get something on discount. And then all of a sudden they all go out of business, et cetera, et cetera. This is an example, maybe a silly one, of a malinvestment, but there were serious ones that happened at that time that Jefferson was writing. And Mike says, whenever the money supply rapidly expands, as it did during the war years of War of 1812, that is, it creates all kinds of malinvestments in the economy. The expansion of credit-fueled land speculation in the West, that likely would not have happened in a more sound monetary environment. Historian George Dangerfield argued that the entire post-war American economy was, quote, based on a land boom. So people had extra money because it was being printed beyond what was actually available to redeem in specie. And so then they started investing in stuff. You can be more risky the more access to funds that you have. And Mike writes that since the U.S. Treasury accepted payments for land in the form of state-issued banknotes, state-chartered banks helped fund the land boom. But the problem was most of them lacked sufficient specie to back their paper. Now, after it opened for business in 1817, the Second Bank of the U.S. supposedly was going to get this all under control, but it jumped right in to further expand money and credit. And here from Rothbard's book, he notes that by the beginning of 1818, so mind you, it's barely open a year, the bank had loaned out over $41 million. Its note issue outstanding reached $10 million, and its demand deposits $13 million, for a total money issue of $23 million. Short version, $23 million by early 1818. But it was contrasted with a specie reserve, so gold reserve of $2.5 million. Rothbard basically points out that what would have been considered stable, not risking the bank's solvency, was about a 5-to-1 ratio. And here we're close to double that, about 10-to-1. And so Rothbard points out that the boom therefore continued in 1818, this land speculation boom, with the Bank of the U.S. acting as an expansionary rather than as a limiting force. The expansionist attitude of the bank was also encouraged by the Treasury. Of course, they were all in on this kind of thing. But that year in 1818, Mike points out that the Second Bank of the U.S. tried to rein in the problem. They started saying, okay, let's try to get this under control. Sounds familiar to what we have today. They participate in creating the problem, and then all of a sudden they're going to say, well, we're going to fix it. So the way they tried to do that was by curtailing loans by its western branches. But when the state banks began presenting their banknotes for redemption at the Second Bank of the U.S., it refused to provide gold specie from its reserves. There was simply too much paper and not enough gold. So then the state banks did the only thing they could do at that point. They had to start foreclosing on heavily mortgaged farms and business properties. So what's the result? almost absolute chaos. And again, this is going to sound pretty familiar to us today. We have widespread bankruptcies. They start seeing bank failures. There were a bunch of them all the way through, I think, 1823. There's high unemployment, all the stuff that Thomas Jefferson basically predicted. And here he is in a letter responding to something from John Adams, which I'll get to in a moment. Jefferson predicted that this is going to keep happening. Boom, crash, boom, bust, over and over and over until people understood the root cause, which of course was a depreciated fiat paper currency. Printing is the root cause. And Jefferson put it this way: the evils of this deluge of paper money are not to be removed until our citizens are generally and radically instructed in their cause and consequences. And what's the problem, of course? As I keep saying, what Jefferson pointed out, the problem is fiat paper money printing. He said, for want of a stable common measure of value that now in use being less fixed than the beads and wampum of the Indian. It's a little, you could read it in full for the context rather than the long sentence there, but basically saying what we have today is not a fixed value. All it can do is go down to zero over time the more that you introduce. Now, as I mentioned, Jefferson was responding to a letter from John Adams the prior month in February of 1819, and Adams was discussing a book that he had read that was basically calling money printing a worse evil than the empires of old. We may have all heard about this, and if you haven't yet, there's a link on this that goes over in some, a decent introduction to it in Mike Meharry's article. Of course, it's all linked to in the show notes, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. But basically, the book that John Adams was discussing with Jefferson, both of them fans of the author, was pointing out that money printing was worse than the empires of old, shaving off a little bit from a gold coin and then trying to pass it off as full weight. So this was the original inflationary government program. They would say, this is a 1 ounce piece of gold, as an example, shave off maybe 10% of it, maybe add a little bit of copper or something else, or just say that it was still 1 ounce, and then they would be able to put more into the economy. And this was the first scam, this first ripoff. But Adams took it to the next level. He called this money printing an infinity of successive felonious larcenies. And he said to Jefferson, if this is true, as I believe it is, we Americans are the most thievish people that ever existed. We have been stealing from each other for 150 years. And a couple of centuries later, it is much, much worse today. As Meharry points out, the government continues to print at a dizzying pace. Just consider, he writes, that the Federal Reserve has created nearly $9 trillion out of thin air since the 2008 financial crisis. That is insane. And so Mike tells us that we can accurately predict another economic meltdown. And it may be a moderate one, it may be a terrible one. Eventually, we're going to see a really bad one, but we will continue to have meltdowns. We know for 100% for sure we'll have one in the future because after more than 200 years, he writes, the problem of paper money remains. The people still have not become radically instructed as to the cause and consequences of the boom-bust cycle that's fueled by printing massive amounts of paper and today electronic money. In other words, Thomas Jefferson called it. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. I really appreciate you watching the show or listening to it, whether it's live or in the archive, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. I can't thank you enough. But if you enjoyed the show and you want to help us get this kind of information out to more and more people, absolutely nothing helps us do this kind of work more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty, depreciated, dirty government fiat, I had to say dirty twice, please consider throwing it our way. We certainly punch way above our weight class, and we use every penny you send our way, every dollar, to take a stand for the Constitution and liberty, whether the government likes it or not. They certainly do not. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I hope to see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.